During much of the French Revolution, the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway pursued a policy of neutrality. It had no real interest in the conflict, and the effective ruler at the time, Crown Prince Frederick VI, was primarily concerned with preventing Sweden from taking control of Norway from Denmark. To that end, Denmark had allied itself primarily to Russia from 1773 onwards to safeguard itself from any Swedish attack. Like so many other facets of Europe from that time, however, the French Revolution turned the politics of Europe on its head, forcing everyone to take a side sooner or later. In the case of Denmark, their side would be chosen for them. As the War of the Second Coalition dragged on and appeared to be going in France's favor, the British clung to the one realm where they held dominance, the sea. The French Navy was already smaller than the British and had suffered a number of setbacks fighting against the British Navy, in large part due to a lack of experienced naval officers, since so many had been nobles that either fled or were stripped of their position. Even so, in combination with Spain, which allied with France in 1796, the French were able to at least put pressure on the British Navy. In 1800, the creation of the League of Armed Neutrality by Russia to protect their trade at sea posed a serious potential threat in the eyes of Britain. The League was an alliance between neutral nations that wished to safeguard their trade with France against Britain's wartime policy of searching all ships suspected of doing trade with France. It consisted of Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Denmark-Norway. If the fleets of these nations were combined, then the League could have posed a serious naval threat to the British, and likely break the British blockade of French ports. Perceiving an immediate threat, a fleet under the command of Admiral Hyde Parker, with Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson as second in command, was assembled to deal with the League. This fleet would be under considerable pressure to act quickly before the winter ice melted in the Baltic, allowing the Russian fleet to set sail. Denmark, as the gate to the Baltic Sea and closest member to Britain, was the first target of Parker's fleet. After the Danes refused a final demand to surrender their fleet to the British for the course of the war against France, the British fleet began moving to attack Copenhagen. Unfortunately for the British, the city boasted strong defenses and a strategic geographical position. The only way to effectively attack the city was by sea through a relatively narrow channel that's depth prevented the heaviest British ships from entering for fear of running aground. To defend their capital, the Danish fleet formed a battle line in front of the city, supported by a large number of floating and land-based batteries. On the other side, British ships were generally larger, more well-armed, and maintained higher quality crews, but were fewer in number. On the morning of April 2, 1801, Nelson led a force of 12 ships of the line, 5 frigates, 6 sloops, and 7 bomb ships into the channel. The remainder of the fleet, which could not enter the channel for fear of running aground, took up positions at both ends of the channel to block escape and provide what support they could. Facing Nelson were 9 ships of the line, 11 sloops, roughly 17 floating batteries and smaller ships, and a number of land-based batteries positioned behind the Danish battle line. Fighting would begin at 10 a.m. and would not end until shortly after 2 p.m., with all Danish guns falling silent. The battle was a slugging match that first appeared to be going the Danes' way, as 3 British ships of the line ran aground early on and were unable to contribute much to the battle. Gradually over time, however, the British guns were able to outperform their Danish counterparts, as while on the surface the Danish position appeared strong, most of their cannons were crewed by hastily trained volunteers. Even so, both sides suffered heavy losses, with the British taking roughly 1,000 casualties and the Danes somewhere around 1,500. British victory effectively ended the Danish threat as part of the League of Armed Neutrality. Soon after, a treaty was signed that forcefully ended Danish neutrality and participation in the League with Russia. The League would soon after collapse as Tsar Paul of Russia was assassinated in March, and his successor, Tsar Alexander, chose to ally with the British. Unfortunately for Denmark, the attack in 1801 would not be their last conflict with the British during the Napoleonic Wars, and would only foreshadow future events. French victory in the wars of the Third and Fourth Coalition would prove to be a disaster for Denmark. As Austria, Prussia, and Russia were defeated one by one and forced to make peace with France, the Danish position became ever more isolated. Denmark-Norway had attempted to resume its policy of neutrality after the British attack in 1801, but its position was severely weakened by its increasing political isolation. The Danish priority was still to maintain control over Norway in the face of Swedish aggression, but Russia, its longtime ally, was quickly becoming unable to provide any real protection. In 1807, Denmark-Norway would find itself caught between French and British interests. as both made demands that would essentially force the country to choose a side in the ongoing war between the two. France primarily wanted Denmark-Norway to join the continental system so as to try and restrict British trade, and was beginning to threaten invasion if their demands were not met. The British, meanwhile, feared that if the French forced the still significant Danish fleet to join the French cause, then British naval superiority could be threatened, and so demanded that the remaining Danish fleet be given to Britain. Russian defeat and rumors from the negotiations surrounding the Treaty of Tilsit that Napoleon was attempting to create a naval alliance against Britain that included the Danish fleet would finally prompt the British to act. A British fleet departed for Denmark in August and again attempted to convince Denmark-Norway to ally with Britain, or at the least surrender its fleet for the duration of hostilities between France and Britain. Again, the Danish government refused, as any such alliance would practically guarantee the loss of mainland territory to French invasion. In response, the British fleet cut off the island of Zealand and prevented reinforcements from reaching Copenhagen. Unlike the first Battle of Copenhagen, the second battle did not have a major naval engagement, due to the Danish fleet staying inside the city's harbor for protection. It instead consisted of a few skirmishes outside the city and a 4-day bombardment of the city itself. While much of the civilian population of the city managed to evacuate before the bombardment, its indiscriminate nature still led to nearly 1,000 casualties and widespread destruction. Faced with no hope of relief and a continuation of the devastating bombardment of the city, Copenhagen surrendered along with the entire Danish fleet on the 7th of September, 1807. The Second Battle of Copenhagen essentially gave Denmark no choice but to ally itself with Napoleon and join Napoleon's continental system. Denmark now found itself at war with Britain and mostly cut off from Norway, which was forced to fend for itself. Denmark was not without some teeth, however, as it would wage a gunboat war against Britain from 1807 until French defeat in 1814. It was called the Gunboat War because the Danes, after losing most of their old fleet, created a new fleet of lightly armed ships with only a few cannons that were meant to attack British shipping through the Danish Straits. In this role, they had mixed success, as the British implemented a convoy system that was able to protect most trade in the region. Gunboats, however, proved remarkably successful and posed a serious threat to convoys, even capturing smaller escort ships on several occasions. The threat Danish gunboats posed to British trade forced the British to devote notable naval resources to the region to protect British shipping and prevent Danish ships from sending support to Norway. For Denmark, the early years of its alliance with France appeared to at least be bearable, as they found themselves on the winning side of a war against Sweden in which Russia seized Finland for itself. That view would sour with Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Denmark was suddenly thrust from a position of relative security to one of potential disaster. Russia was no longer an ally, and even worse, now supported Sweden gaining Norway as compensation for losing Finland. The British were also unwilling to guarantee Danish control over Norway, even during attempts to convince Denmark to switch sides. Denmark was trapped in an unwinnable position. Should Denmark have attempted to switch sides, there was no guarantee that their new allies would allow them to keep Norway, but victory with Napoleon was looking less likely every passing month. Despite serious consideration to switch sides on multiple occasions, in the end, King Frederick, despite opposition from a number of high-ranking people in Denmark, decided to stick with Napoleon to the bitter end. The odds may have been against Napoleon, but Frederick hoped that the War of the Sixth Coalition would end in some form of negotiated peace that would somehow see Denmark maintain control over Norway with French support. In 1813, Swedish forces took the opportunity to invade Denmark from the south after Napoleon's disastrous defeat at Leipzig, forcing Frederick to finally face the fact that Norway would be lost to Sweden. In 1814, negotiations began to end hostilities between Denmark and the Sixth Coalition. Denmark was forced to give up continental Norway to Sweden, but through a bit of deception between the Danish and Swedish negotiator, Denmark was allowed to keep all overseas Norwegian territory, notably Greenland and Iceland. How did they do this, you might ask? Well, they simply lied and claimed that those territories were never part of the Kingdom of Norway, and made sure that was noted in the treaty. A small victory in a conflict that had seen Denmark pay a heavy price. After all was said and done, Denmark came out of the Napoleonic Wars worse off than many, but still better than some. It had lost Norway, been devastated economically, but managed to hold on to much of its overseas territory. Frederick had failed in his primary objective of keeping Denmark-Norway together, but it is hard to imagine that there was much he could have done to succeed. with Denmark placed in such a weak position both geographically and politically. Denmark came out of the Napoleonic Wars as a minor power on a continent that was tired of war but full of competition. It would not be drawn into war again until 1864, when it lost significant territory to Austria and Prussia as part of the Wars of German Unification.